This video is brought to you by Squarespace, the #1 website platform for entrepreneurs. I have something really exciting to share with you guys. This is the new Panasonic S1R Mark II. And on the spec sheet, this thing is absolutely loaded for the price. But the big question here is, how does it stack up against other full frame cameras like the R5 Mark II and the Sony A7R5? I think it's first really important to do a little housekeeping. We all know what happened with the Japan and S9. We're not trying to do all that. We're trying to focus on this right here. Lumix flew us out to Norway for a couple of days to test out this camera. We were able to take the camera home to keep, but Lumix does not have any input, nor do they don't get to see this video before publishing. And as with all my camera reviews, I'm always going to point out the flaws if I see any, because no camera is perfect. Since I normally don't use Panasonic cameras, I feel like if I'm gonna give you the most value in this video, I'm gonna stick to my expertise, because this camera is absolutely stacked on the video side more than, again, I don't normally use Panasonic, and oh my God, all the things that I found in here that my Sony or the Canons don't do, it's pretty overwhelming. So I'm gonna stick to photography. If you wanna learn more about the video on this camera, there's plenty of creators out there like Cam Mackey, Terry Warfield, Kofi, Zach Mayfield, Connor McCaskill, and so on. So I think context is important. When talking about this camera, you can skip this part if you want. But before heading out to Norway, I read up on the rumors, and low-key, I almost did not go on this trip. The reason why I am nervous for this trip is because, well, we all know what happened last year in Japan. Panasonic flew us out there for an entry-level camera. Now I'm going across the world again to Norway. This time, it's rumored that the S1R2 is going to be announced, and I'm good with that. This is going to be a flagship camera, but is this going to be a trickle down of the Leica SL3, which I hope it's not? I'm going to tell you my biggest concern is that this camera is going to be based on that 60 megapixel Leica sensor. It's great for photography, but that 60 megapixels is a slow sensor. We were not allowed to film in the event, but let me tell you, Lumix absolutely dropped a bomb on us with this camera. I don't know if it's because my expectations were so low, but I couldn't believe how stacked this camera was. Okay, so what is this camera packing for photographers? It's got a brand new 44 megapixel sensor. This is the same sensor that's in the DJI Ronin 8K. So we've never actually seen it used in a photography application. It has the latest L2 processing chip. This does not have a secondary AI chip that we're used to seeing with other flagships. Lumix claims that this camera has up to 14 stops of dynamic range. That's with DR expansion on, and then 13 stops with it off. You can shoot up to 40 frames per second in RAW blackout free with the electronic shutter. There is a catch to that, but it can do it. Up to 10 frames per second with mechanical. It has a new 177 megapixel high resolution mode. It has that you can also use handheld. It has a 779 point phase detection autofocus system with real-time recognition. This autofocus system is new, but it's still technically based on the autofocus system that's in the S5 II. You get up to 8 stops of IBIS, which chasing the Northern Lights, I shot a 2-second exposure handheld. It was bang on, it was insane. You get a brand new 1.8 million dot 4-angle tilt screen. Every camera from this point forward, every hybrid camera needs to have a 4-way tilt screen. It's really hard to go back to a traditional flip out screen when you use something like this. It has a super sharp 5.76 million dot EVF, dual card slots, one CF Express Type B, one SD card with, it's a UHS 2 slot. And of course you get access to the Lumix Lab and all the LUTs, which is one of my favorite parts of using Panasonic so far. And how can I forget? A 1/250 flash sync speed, but also a new shutter mechanism. So the shutter mechanism in here is a carbon fiber or carbon fiber infused shutter. It's rated up to 400,000 shots. And the nice part about it is you can use it to prevent getting dust in your sensor. So when you take off a lens, it closes instantly. Unlike my Sony A1 where it takes like 3 seconds, I gotta wait 3 seconds for it to close, to take off my lens. This one happens damn near instantaneously, which is very, very nice. The Panasonic S1R is the first Panasonic that I'm ever testing out in a studio environment. I'm curious to see how it's gonna perform in my normal workflow, what the skin tones look like, what is the autofocus, how does the autofocus perform in a studio environment? Am I gonna get eyelashes or am I gonna get eyeballs? Now for this setup specifically, I'm using a 7-foot parabolic umbrella as my key light, and then I'm using this FJ800 light with an optical spot. And what I'm gonna do is project a shade, some old school shades, because we got a vintage telephone here, we got a vintage vibe. Projecting this as kind of like a complementary light, I think it'll add some nice to the photo. So let's start. And I'll tell you what, a little trick when you're shooting in the studio is don't take for granted the little things like the subject distance from the background. This specific look here it would look totally different if she was just a foot closer to the background. And because this parabolic umbrella doesn't have like a grid, you know, that I can control the light, well, I just got to use distance to kind of feather the light away from the background, and it just gives it more dimension, I guess. All right, 1, 2, 3. Now with the Canon R5 Mark II and the 85 1.2, same settings as the Lumix. Okay, 1, 2, 3. Now Sony A7R5 with the 85 1.4 Sigma. Let's see, yep, good, 1, 2, 3. After loading up the images into Lightroom and comparing the files between the Lumix and the Canon, the only thing that stood out to me was the slight difference in the hues of the reds on the backdrop paper and in the skin tones. Other than that, if this was a blind test, I would not be able to tell you which image was shot on what camera. Now comparing it to the Sony, this is when it was a little bit more obvious to me what camera I used for each image. The Sony was slightly more detailed, but the dead giveaway to me are the skin tones, and that they're far more orange than on the Lumix. Usually a slight tweak to the white balance will give me a more neutral skin tone, but I do think that the skin tone straight out of camera on the Lumix are just as good as the Canon. At the same time, you can take this information with a grain of salt if you always use a gray card before each shoot. Now this is when things get interesting. So for this next photo, I purposefully shot with slit lighting so that I could have part of the image in deep shadow so that I could test out the dynamic range and overall file flexibility. Now, when I recovered the shadows on both the Sony and the Lumix and zoomed in to the shadow side where the glasses and her hair, I noticed some digital noise start to creep in on her glasses and in her hair. Then I raised the blacks all the way, and the artifacts only got worse on the Lumix file, while the Sony did have a little bit of noise creep in, but it was still just like a fine grain. Comparing to the Canon file, it was almost the same exact result. This is also consistent with some of the other tests I did back home. Now, in a real-world application, information like this would be important to me if I were shooting mostly on location with uncontrolled light. Because in the studio, there is absolutely no reason to push the files this hard or even remotely this hard. If you plan on really pushing those shadows, the Lumix is just not up to par with the Canon and Sony, but at the same time, this is something that you're only gonna really notice if you zoom past 100%. Hey you, what are you waiting for? It's 2025. It's time to finally start a website with Squarespace. Now, if you wanna start a website, blog, or even an online store, say less. I've been using Squarespace for years now, and I don't think you realize how easy and intuitive it is to use. You can easily grab your own custom domain and then build a site that looks professional without needing a single coding or design skill. And I'm talking zero tech knowledge required.
They also have some of the best SEO tools that will help your site get discovered by exactly who you want to find it. With design intelligence powered by AI, it'll help you create a site that's uniquely yours and your style with no effort required. Seriously, it's like having your own personal designer. Now, if you want to make some side hustle money, you can create an online store like I did and make some money while you sleep. So if you have been waiting for the right moment to start, this is it. You can get 10% off your first purchase if you use the coupon code Manny.
Okay, so I feel like one thing that isn't talked about enough in these camera videos is what the experience was like using the actual camera. I know that it's mostly a subjective thing, but I feel like there's value in that, especially since I use mostly Sony and Canon here in the studio. So what were the things that I like and I didn't like? The autofocus was bang on. I had zero issues. I really like how the Lumix camera has a constant preview feature, right? And specifically how I can map it to a custom button. For those that don't know what that is, if I'm adjusting my settings here in the studio, and let's say I'm killing the ambient lighting in here and you can't see the model, well, thankfully this camera can focus perfectly even if you can't see the model. But if I want to see her and I want to see the facial expressions that she's making, I want to see what I'm doing, I can hit constant preview. And now, no matter what I do with my settings, I'm gonna be able to see everything and the camera's gonna be able to focus perfectly. You'd be surprised, there are cameras out there like the Hasselblad X2D that doesn't even give you a constant preview feature that you can activate in the menu. So when the screen is dark and you're killing the ambient lighting in the studio and your modeling light isn't strong enough to illuminate the model, it's gonna struggle with autofocus. Cameras like the Canon R5 Mark II doesn't even allow you to turn constant preview off. So the moment it detects a flash trigger, that screen is gonna get bright and now you can't turn it off. So now you can't see what your ambient lighting is. You have to turn your flash trigger off to be able to see what your ambient exposure is. Sony allows you to do this as well. So that is something that I really have come to appreciate with these cameras. I also really like that this camera has a 1/250 of a second flash sync speed. You'd be surprised how many cameras out there in this price range with a 1/200 or under flash sync speed. So I really like that. Gives me a little bit more control over the ambient lighting in the studio without having to use, let's say, the aperture or something else to compensate. Also, I had to get used to this camera because in continuous autofocus, it beeps, which is interesting. I'm not used to that. But I have grown to like it because I feel like when I'm shooting with the model, I'm usually doing a countdown for every shot, or not, I'm just snapping photos. At least this, it gives her a confirmation that I'm about to take a photo, even though I am in continuous autofocus. Now back to how Lumix throws everything in this camera. I really appreciate how you can shoot photos directly to an external SSD instead of an SD card. So I could put my external drive connected to my camera and shoot all of my photos to the external SD, so I don't have to do the SD card dance. I could go straight to the computer after and upload the photos directly from that. I also really like how the EVF feels when I put the camera up to my face. It's really comfortable and the EVF is really nice and sharp. Just a really nice experience, the way it sits on the orbital bone here. Now, two things that I didn't like about the camera. And the first one is the screen. Now, I love the screen mechanism. I absolutely love it, but I find that it doesn't give me like the truest representation of the photo that I just took, right? For the shoot, I didn't tether for this photo shoot because I was testing 3 different cameras and I was working really fast. But moving forward, I think this is probably the move with the Lumix. Now, this is something that I complain about all the time with the Sony, is the screen quality. The screen is, and especially the Lumix screen, the Lumix is smaller than even the Sony. It's a pretty thin screen. So tethering is definitely going to help if you're gonna be really precise with your lighting. Another thing that I noticed, battery life isn't great. I couldn't really judge it in Norway because it was cold, but even in the studio, just normal operation, this camera does chew through batteries pretty quickly. The Lumix menu system, oh my God, the Lumix menu system. This has to be one of the harder ones to navigate. And I can only imagine even dedicated Lumix users still have trouble finding certain things in here, because that's how I was with Sony. I dedicated Sony shooter for the longest time. I still struggled with the older menu system. And this one is no different. This one is, there's too many options. All right, so as I was editing this video last night, I realized that I have so much footage and examples to share about this camera that it would actually be a disservice to everyone if I just crammed it all in to a video that seems rushed, because I'm trying to make that embargo date. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna separate these videos, okay? Like overall, the autofocus system, very promising so far, especially with the real-time recognition, but I still see potential issues that I want to fully test. I want to do more real-world tests comparing the dynamic range, because so far, this camera is slightly behind the competition from what I can see. I want to do a proper tracking test the burst rates. I want to compare the IBIS, because I was somehow able to get a 2-second exposure handheld of the Northern Lights while standing on a sheet of ice out there, which was really impressive. But it requires, this camera is so feature packed, it's gonna take a little bit more time. Usually the point in time when I kind of go off a cliff and rant a little bit, but I have to get these thoughts out of my head, okay? The intangibles with this camera, I feel like it's important, because these are the things that I can't measure and compare with other brands. But let me put it to you like this. I don't pick up my Sony camera because it's fun to use. I pick it up because it gets the job done the way I need it to get done. I don't get inspired when I pick up my Sony cameras. I never feel the urge to pick them up and experiment with my photography. With the S1RII, and I try not to, I sometimes question, is this the honeymoon phase of a camera? I usually, that happens. But no, I still feel like that even after a lot of usage, and I'm actually sick and tired of looking at this camera because I've been using it so much lately. There is a fun factor to this camera. It brings that fun factor of the S9, the infamous S9, and it primarily comes from being able to apply LUTs to images, and with how intuitive and easy the app is, I can pick up this camera, I choose the LUT that I want, or whatever the look that I want for the specific image, usually my dogs and just life or whatever. I can choose the LUT, take a photo, share it to my phone super fast, and I don't know, there's just a fun factor to this camera that I feel that is lacking from my other cameras. This also goes hand in hand with how the camera sounds and feels. I know a lot of people disagree that these little things matter, but the way the camera feels in the hand, the way it sounds, it has a very pleasing shutter sound. But with that, I digress. I think it's worth making a lot more content on this camera. It is absolutely stacked, but let's not get ahead of ourselves here. We just got it a couple of weeks ago, and yeah,